Okay, good evening, everybody. Glad that you could join us this evening for another in our Information Plus Hour. For those of you who may not know, we started this about a year ago, and we've had some outstanding presentations, just trying to get information out there to the community. We started off with Mr. Horace Johnson last May, followed by Judge Beverly Scarlett. We had Beverly Payne, we had Sandra Wilson, Quentin Parker, Danita Mason Hogans. We had a lot of folk, great folk to come and share their expertise with us, and we continue that tradition this evening with Christie Norris, who is no stranger to teachers in the state of North Carolina. Christie serves as the director of Carolina K-12 at UNC Chapel Hill, which works to serve K-12 educators around the state with free, high-quality resources. Christie designs and facilitates professional development programs for teachers in each of North Carolina's 100 counties, as well as writes middle and high school curriculum. She's a strong advocate of K-12 educators and promotes appreciation for the difficult work of teachers and the challenges they face. She previously served as an education policy fellow with the North Carolina Public School Forum, is a 2020 recipient of the Bryan Public Service Award, and is committed to issues of equity in education, culturally responsive teaching, and socio-emotional learning. Prior to joining Carolina K-12 in 2006, Christie taught social studies in Durham Public Schools and previously served as the assistant director of an educational nonprofit in New York City's PS 38. Christie is a graduate of Virginia Tech University. Welcome, Christie, to Information Plus Hour. It's yours.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here with all of you. Thank you, Dr. Parker, for inviting me. I didn't realize the list of royalty that I am following with this presentation, so thanks for making me nervous by listing off all those great people before I talk. So I want to again say thank you to all of you for taking the time to be here to think about how K-12 education is being impacted by the debates and the polarization that is all ultimately spawned by today's culture wars that we have been engaged in for several years now. And buckle up your seatbelts, folks, because we're in a pretty big election year too. So I just want to start tonight with a little bit about Carolina K-12. For those of you who may not know about us, Miss Moore Sloan can certainly tell you about us probably better than I can, but I am the director of Carolina K-12. As Freddie mentioned, we're a program at UNC Chapel Hill. We're situated in a program called Carolina Public Humanities, which does lifelong learning programs. And my work grants me the absolute honor of working with teachers in all 100 counties of North Carolina. So it's my work with teachers around the state, the fact that I'm a former classroom teacher myself. I taught 8th grade history in Durham Public Schools. And the fact that I'm a parent that really makes the topic of K-12 education deeply important, but also deeply personal for me. And with over 20 years of experience in public education, I can tell you that amazing things are happening in North Carolina's public schools all around the state. Teachers are doing more with less. They are literally making magic from Manio to Murphy. But I can also tell you that our teachers are in the midst of what many of them say are the hardest years of their careers. We might have thought that that would have been during the years right at the height of the pandemic or the years directly after, but in so many ways, now around the state is when teachers are experiencing not only that apex of so-called learning loss, but increased socio-emotional needs of students, exacerbated mental health concerns, working in a system that is understaffed, underfunded, COVID support funds are now dwindling and running out. And so literally the system is bursting at the seams with expanded need. And so I just want to say all of that because I think it's important to remember that this is the context in which our teachers are experiencing the debates and the rhetoric surrounded history education that we're going to talk about tonight. And I really want to ask each of you as we spend this evening together, regardless of where you typically find yourself falling politically, that you really lean in with curiosity, to think as we go through about what you can do as an individual and with your community to reframe the narrative, to really refocus our communities on valuing and supporting teachers as professionals. Because I am here to tell you that despite all that we're going to talk about tonight, the bottom line is that our public school system cannot thrive without teachers who are valued, who are professionalized, and thus our students cannot thrive without teachers who thrive. And the culture wars that our society is entrenched in, the identity politics, all of which are becoming worsened and exacerbated by social media, this is all corrosive to our communities and it's corrosive to our schools. But we can change that and we have to change that. And so we have a lot to talk about tonight. I want to start just as I tell teachers to do when they're in their own classrooms, to ground us in a little bit of intention this evening. And for this, I turn to the great W.B. Du Bois, who in 1935 wrote, "Nations reel and stagger on their way. They make hideous mistakes. They commit frightful wrongs. They do great and beautiful things. And shall we not best guide humanity by telling the truth about all of this so far as the truth is ascertainable?" And one of my wonderful advisory board members, Eric Johnson, is a fabulous writer, said something very similar when he did an op-ed for the News and Observer that said, "Our history, it's neither an unbroken march of progress nor a doomed loop of despair. It's a complicated mess, just like the present. And having a sense of curiosity about where we came from is an act of civic pride." An act of civic pride. And so I want you to keep that in mind as we go through tonight. And so my plan for, I guess, about an hour, Dr. Parker, yes, is to provide an overview of the debate that's been surrounding our history classrooms, which is actually a debate that's influencing whether or not we teach what I characterize as hard history. And I'll talk about what I mean by hard history in just a minute. I want to give you a quick and broad look, really back to 2019 to today, that section of the timeline about this debate over history education. And we'll talk about how it's been playing out specifically in the state of North Carolina within the context of the nation. For tonight's purposes, I'm going to focus on K-12 education. That's what I do. But of course, the same issues are at play at the university level as well. If you follow the news, you've seen that certainly. And the other thing I just want to put a little caveat on this is that over the past, especially I'd say the last 6 years, this has really been a constantly moving political machine of many different parts. And so legislation gets written, it gets proposed, it gets voted in, or it gets vetoed. And this process has entangled literally every level of government, from federal to state to now local counties and school boards. And so it's a lot to try to cover in just a short period of time. So most recently, we now see that the conundrum has jumped even beyond history. And so now we're hearing a lot about book banning. We're hearing a lot about legislation regarding LGBTQ issues in classrooms. Tonight, we're just going to really kind of focus on the rhetoric around the history classroom. But I say that to say there are so many moving parts to this. So when we talk tonight, I think there are other things happening even more now that you can compare this to. And the other thing I want to do is really just be very clear and explicit about how we at Carolina K-12 think history should be taught, and why we think it is imperative that a comprehensive history be taught. And I'll talk just a tiny bit about the strategies and the ways we think this work can be successfully done, because if done poorly, it can be harmful. I think we need to ensure our future leaders that are in our K-12 classrooms really leave feeling engaged and empowered, because as Dr. Hassan Jeffries wrote, hard history is not exclusively a story of despair. Hard history is not hopeless history. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then, like I said, I think regardless of where you stand politically, or even where you stand on these exact issues, I want everybody to understand how this type of rhetoric is damaging to our teachers, to our schools, and thus ultimately to our children. You might say that the culture wars that our society is engaged in, the identity politics that everyone seems to be entrenched in, it's flooding our schools, and our teachers are drowning because of it. And none of this is good for our society or for our children on the whole. And then finally tonight, I want to leave you just with some questions to ponder, not answers, but some questions to consider as you go back to your everyday lives, including why so much attention around history classrooms when there are so many real and actual proven problems in K-12 education that we could and should be dealing with? And is there anything that we can actually do about this? Spoiler alert, I think yes. And so we'll talk a little bit about this all in an hour or less. So really quickly, what do I mean when I say hard history? Hard history, in my mind, refers to historical topics, events, periods, people, places, time that are, just as the phrase says, that are hard. They can be difficult to teach, they can be difficult to learn about, they can be difficult to face, really due to the themes that are involved. And so these are themes such as violence, injustice, oppression, racism, genocide, grief, pain, trauma. Hard history also, I would say, almost always reverberates into the present. And because of this, that makes it even more hard. And because of the difficulty, you'll see that this type of history often triggers denial and defensiveness, and even fundamental disagreements about who we are and what values we hold. And we actually see exactly this playing out in the public debate that has continued throughout the past decade. And perhaps part of that is because such histories can complicate, not entirely disregard, but complicate the concept of American exceptionalism. And I think also regarding terminology, it's worth pointing out that let me just I've got some pop-ups coming there. It's also pointing out that you might recall a few years back, the news lit up over what I say was a mislabeled enemy. There was a lot of fussing, a lot of rhetoric about the alleged teaching of critical race theory in K-12 classrooms, which, according to accusers, was basically teachers indoctrinating students to hate America. Critical race theory was really just a misused catch-all term for, I would say, any discussion of history or current events that is hard. Oftentimes history labeled as Black history, Indigenous history, anything that was about trying to bring stories from the margins to the center has really been kind of tackled and labeled. And while we all know that kindergarten teachers are not slipping critical race theory into circle time between crisscross applesauce and the ABCs 1, 2, 3s, I do want to make explicitly clear where Carolina K-12 stands on the teaching of hard history. Critical race theory is not being taught in K-12 schools. Hard history should be taught in K-12 schools. And so let me talk a little bit about that. I would argue that it is essential that teachers be encouraged and supported to learn about, to teach about, to openly discuss our nation's shared hard history, naturally in great appropriate ways, as teachers who are professionals know how to do, because this is how we ensure that students understand the implications of our past, their direct connections to the present, and are empowered to address the challenges of the future. How else will they assume the roles as our future leaders and be able to clean up all the messes that we are literally making right now? So Ida B. Wells said that the way to right past wrongs is to shine the light of truth upon them. Students, our future leaders, can't avoid repeating the mistakes of the past if they don't learn about them in their classrooms today. And likewise, they can't build on past successes if they don't learn about those as well. So I would argue if this nation is going to create educated, critical thinkers and doers ready to succeed in diverse workplaces as part of a global society, if they're going to make America the best place to live, to do business, to innovate, then schools have a responsibility to provide a thorough, a comprehensive, an accurate, and a fact-based education, and that includes in our history education. And so with Carolina K-12, there are some really specific tenets that we work with teachers on how to navigate this work. You can see some of them there. I think, again, hard history absolutely has to be taught in age-appropriate ways. And I do agree, students should not feel shame or blame when learning history because those feelings are very disempowering, but they do need to feel. And this is not indoctrination, another word that has been tossed around quite a lot lately in this debate, as if we're firmly back in the McCarthy era or, something like that. Using primary sources, you'll see there, for instance, which has been a major push in social studies for years and years, is about teaching critical thinking and analysis. Teachers aren't teaching students what to think. They're teaching students how to think. And our students need to know how to think, again, to live in this world. And I think this work can be done. We can face the full past because, again, hard history is not hopeless history. So let me just indulge me here for just a quick second to go on a little history mini lecture. I know many of you are joining from Hillsborough. And so I wanted just to give you an example of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about teaching hard history that relates to some of your own local history. I'm sure many of you know who this is because you're all scholars and smarty pants in your own right. But this is Elizabeth Keckley. And Elizabeth was born in 1818 as Elizabeth Lizzie Hobbs, and she was born enslaved. She was born enslaved in Virginia. She was loaned to a family member of her enslaver, and basically in 1835, she ends up here in North Carolina in the town of Hillsborough, which I think many of you are sitting in today. And she lives with the Burwell family, who's the property you can visit there in Hillsborough today. And her early life is much the hard reality that we have to face when learning a true history of enslavement. It was brutal in many ways, and part of our responsibility as teachers is to teach that history. So for 6 years, she's enslaved with the Burwells in Hillsborough. She said later in her memoir that she published, she did the work of 3 servants. She was brutally beaten by the Reverend Burwell and a neighbor. She was repeatedly assaulted for over 4 years by a local white man, resulting in Elizabeth's son, whose name was George. But despite all of that, things change for Elizabeth due to her own agency and her own incredible skill and fortitude. When she was a child, her mother had taught her how to sew. And it turns out that she's incredibly gifted and brilliant at sewing. And so as the daughter of her mother's enslaver, she'd also been able to learn to read and write. So this woman is smart. She is resilient. She is talented with a needle. And so out of the hardship into which she is born, despite every unimaginable thing she faced within that system of enslavement, she goes on to purchase her own freedom. She goes on to start her own dressmaking business, and she becomes seamstress to the stars, to the political elite of the day, basically, including making dresses for the wife of Jefferson Davis, for First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln. Keckley also founds and serves as the president of the first Black Contraband Relief Association, which assists freed refugees streaming into the nation's capital after the Civil War. And she eventually writes a memoir behind the scenes. And so if you study this image, this is not what students are thinking about when they think of enslaved people. They are often thinking of very stereotypical a very kind of archetype. And so to complicate that and make sure that they learn about folks like Elizabeth Keckley and to think about the skills, these are some of her designs. So for students to think about what skills did it take to make something like this in the 1800s, to design these dresses for the president's wife, for the first lady, to whom Elizabeth Keckley eventually becomes personal dressmaker. And in the first lady's words, best friends, that's a little bit of a complication there that we don't have time to get into. But regardless, this is an incredible story that we would miss, that our students would miss if we completely bury or brush aside the hard parts of our history. And it does not get harder than what Elizabeth Keckley endured, but it also doesn't get more incredible than celebrating the way that she forged her own path to freedom as a Black woman in the 1850s and 60s, who resisted and persevered, as did so many other enslaved people, to the best of their ability in a myriad of ways. So again, slavery was excruciating. We have to teach that, but then we also have to teach how hard history isn't hopeless history. Students also need to learn about the resistance and the resilience. And who can argue that this isn't a story, that this isn't history that our young students should know? And, she's just one example of hundreds of stories that lie within the hardships of our past. Historian and writer David Siselsky, I think Freddie's probably buddies with David because he knows everybody, was actually talking about another incredible figure from North Carolina's history, Abraham Galloway, when he said that in many ways we have been denied the best parts of our past, places and things that happen that we can draw strength from, that we can draw inspiration from, that we can get a better lesson on who we are as we try to fashion a life in this crazy world that we're in. So quickly, mini history lesson number 2, despite the hard parts of Abraham Galloway's life, who was born enslaved in what is today's Southport, North Carolina, at age 19, he escapes on a ship, hidden away, leaving Wilmington to Philadelphia. He makes his way to Canada, but he comes back to the South to help other enslaved people escape to the North, including his mother. He comes back for his mother. He goes on to serve as a Union spy, to help develop a clandestine network of spies to aid the Union cause. He recruits Black soldiers to serve in North Carolina's 1st Regiment of U.S. colored troops. He rises to prominent leadership, and not just in the Wilmington area to where he returned, but all around the state and all around the nation, to the point that he ends up leading a delegation to meet Abraham Lincoln in 1864, where he sits with him and basically encourages him to grant equality and full citizenship to Black Americans. It's incredible. And I'll be honest, Abraham Galloway is totally my history crush. Like, this man I just think he must have had the most intense swagger. He stays very politically involved. In 1868, Galloway was elected state senator in North Carolina as part of that first group of African Americans and representatives elected during Reconstruction, where he continued to work for civil rights, labor rights, minimum wage. He introduced the first amendments for women's suffrage. And this is only a small fraction of this man's whole life accomplishments. But again, here is this incredible story of a man born into slavery who never even learned to read or write because that was forbidden, but becomes one of the most influential Black men in North Carolina and a well-known abolitionist. It's said, we all know the name Frederick Douglass, but Abraham Galloway was so popular, it said that he didn't introduce Frederick Douglass when he spoke. Frederick Douglass introduced Galloway. And yet he's a name that we, don't have at the tip of our tongue quite like Frederick Douglass. And so again, just like Elizabeth Keckley and countless others, he represents that resistance and the resilience and the hope that I'm talking about, that our young people need to know about. Because despite all the hard histories that these stories involve, they are American stories. It's hard history, but that exemplifies the hope and the tenacity of oppressed people. So it's not anti-American in any way to teach hard history. Going back to that quote I opened with, I would argue it's actually an act of civic pride. It's an act of love. And the last thing I'll share is just another North Carolina favorite. If Galloway is my history crush, Pauli Murray is my history best friend. Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray believed that holding America accountable is actually patriotic. The Reverend came of age during Jim Crow and faced about every barrier a person could, but never stopped fighting for civil and human rights, and said when asked for an opinion of America, "I love America, and whatever she hands me, I'm handing her back with, I hope, a championship quality. Many of my heroes have been the champions, the Jackie Robinsons, the people who climbed over and said, 'I'll show you.' Plus America's dream. Some people might call it her pretensions. I want to see America be what she says she is, and I consider it part of my responsibility to do that. It's a kind of patriotism. Holding America accountable is a kind of patriotism. When you love something, you want to make it better, just like our children. If I didn't correct my child on the mistakes he made, he would be a spoiled brat. Sometimes is behaving like a spoiled brat for this very reason, right? But again, with Dr. Murray, this is from someone who was denied admission to UNC Chapel Hill because Murray was Black. This from someone who was denied admission to Harvard because of gender. But Pauli Murray loved America and spent an entire life pushing this country to live up to those founding documents, pushing America to be what she says she is. So don't worry, I'm not going to go into mini history lesson number 3, but I hope you take my point that history can heal. It can give us hope if we let it. And this is the type of history our young folks need to know. So I think it's worthwhile to look at how we got to where we are today, to come back to this debate, which is really a debate between people who say children shouldn't be burdened with the difficult parts of our history, compared to those of us who believe that students need to be taught a comprehensive past in order to understand how its legacy shapes America today, because that is how we reconcile and move forward for the better. As my grandfather always said, when you know better, you do better. And so we need to know better so that we can do better. For our purposes, I want to just start us back in January 2018, when the Southern Poverty Law Center released its Teaching the Hard History of American Slavery report. And this report, which you can still read today, it's an excellent report. And Hassan Jeffries, who I quote quite a lot, wrote the foreword to this report. It basically said that, unfortunately, schools are not adequately teaching the history of American slavery, that educators aren't sufficiently prepared to teach it overall, that textbooks do not have appropriate material about it, and as a result, that students in America lack a basic knowledge of the important role that slavery played in shaping the United States and the impact that it continues to have on race relations in America today. And so it was actually in response to this report that Carolina K-12 launched a Teaching Hard History initiative, a professional development initiative designed to help teachers navigate what has increasingly become a landmine field, right? And so not too long after that, there was no noise about that report. Not too long after that, in August of 2019, the New York Times 1619 Project, y'all have heard of that, right? was published. A journalism project, as you know, that was developed by Nicole Hannah-Jones, and its goal was to reframe the country's history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contribution of Black Americans at the center of United States' narrative. And this, in many ways, brought a traditionally scholarly level of a conversation about the impact of racism from history to today more into a mainstream narrative. This is, this beautiful magazine that's published in the New York Times, and it starts to spread about. And I would say that based on both of these initiatives, I saw the needle move a little bit. in the K-12 classroom. Educators start looking more for resources to ensure they're teaching a more holistic and comprehensive history of our country. In this period, pre-pandemic, no one had lost their mind about the 1619 project just yet. But of course, at this point in 2019, we start hearing rumblings of a coronavirus that winter. And by March of 2020, our entire world, as we had known it, is turned upside down as the globe finds itself entrenched in a pandemic and the United States heads into quarantine. Just thinking about that period, I don't know about you guys, but it makes me stress and tense up. I have terrible memories of remote learning with my son. So these were hard times. But in all seriousness, let's not forget that right before this on February 23rd, 2020, 25-year-old Ahmaud Arbery was shot and killed by armed white residents while he was just jogging through a Georgia neighborhood. 3 months later, further into some of the most stressful and uncertain moments of the pandemic, on May 25th, 2020, George Floyd is killed by police. Nationwide protests erupt with the Black Lives Matter movement, and we find ourselves within a time of both isolation, but also a very public racial reckoning that starts to take place. And so I think around this time, so much could no longer go unseen. Many corporations and businesses and even schools start to take up new anti-racism initiatives. This is when we start to see a lot of DEI work come to the forefront, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. There were statements, there were trainings, there were task forces, there were new hires. It seemed like finally there was a real public conversation and some real movement happening about so many things that had before been avoided or hushed. But it does not take long in this context for largely conservative commentators to start pushing back hard against the Black Lives Matter movement. And that then bleeds out into a major pushback on the very concepts of diversity, equity, inclusion in general. It starts to be claimed that the concept of white privilege, talking about the idea of systemic racism, these are, according to these commentators themselves, racist and divisive. And so diversity, equity, inclusion, you could say, become trigger words for the far right. And one of the loudest voices at this time was a man named Christopher Rufo. This is a senior fellow at the very far right leaning Manhattan Institute. He's widely credited with popularizing the labeling of these types of trainings as critical race theory. On September 2nd, 2020, he even appeared on then Tucker Carlson's Fox News show, urging then President Donald Trump to take action and to stop all DEI initiatives and trainings in federal agencies. And so after that appearance, it's reported that Mark Meadows, Trump's chief of staff at the time, reaches out to Mark Rufo, that this is kind of when the spark catches fire, that ultimately the Trump team senses an issue gaining steam with far right-wing conservatives. Here is something we can use to stir the pot, to capture the minds and imaginations of, this new American enemy of critical race theory. People are feeling scared. We're losing our minds. We're feeling uncomfortable with these new ideas that are being put out. Things feel like they're changing, they're shifting. And this is literally a recipe for a real good propaganda campaign. And so in September of 2020, the Trump White House issues an executive order for banning critical race theories use by federal agencies, calling critical race theory a propaganda effort. On Constitution Day, September 17th, 2020, then President Trump announced he was creating a 1776 commission. I don't know if any of you remember this. The goal was to promote patriotic education. From this point forward is when you see the movement against so-called critical race theory. It turns its sights to our nation's schools. Schools that, again, were reeling from a global pandemic. Schools that had actual measurable problems, overwhelming need and problems. But this is what is chosen to take over the rhetoric surrounding K-12 education. And so on January 18th, 2021, yes, that is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day, the Trump White House releases the 1776 report. It calls for focusing classroom discussions of the U.S. founding era on the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and not on fashionable ideologies like claims of systemic racism that threaten national unity. The implication, by the way, that social studies courses don't already teach America's founding documents is absurd. I'm sure if we ask Miss Moore Sloan if she teaches the Declaration and the Constitution, right. That's just, the idea that you need legislation to, implying that it's not happening. Again, total propaganda. It's also worth noting that the report, the commission or the report didn't involve any historians who were U.S. history experts. Many historians actually condemned the report. I wouldn't be surprised if Dr. Freddie Parker's name was not on there. If he was asked, I'm sure it would have been. But the American Historical Association releases a statement signed by 47 academic organizations and characterized the report as a simplistic interpretation that relies on falsehoods, inaccuracies, omissions, and misleading statements, and a screed against a half-century of historical scholarship. And so while neither the 1776 Commission or its report had any real power to compel school districts to do anything, this was an early peek at how far-right activists would take up this cause to rally its base on the subject of controversial history education. So sit with that for a minute. In a time when our schools are desperately struggling, our teachers are on the front lines, literally in their classrooms, masked up, talking 8 hours a day during a mismanaged national health crisis like we had never seen before. Here is a movement to create a new news cycle with something new and scarier to fear. It's indoctrination in the history classroom that we need to fear right now. And so the 1776 Commission was short-lived, only because President Joe Biden terminated it on his inauguration day. But that spark of propaganda was already lit, and far-right conservatives were not stupid. They were not stupid, they are not stupid, and they knew what they had, and they just threw fuel all over it, because now we see a fervent spread with far-right conservative education advocacy groups who start to become involved in the cause. And so you have things like the 1776 Action. This is a group that launched, if you remember, the 1776 Pledge to Save Our Schools, asking candidates for office to vow to restore honest, patriotic education that cultivates in our children a profound love of our country. We have groups like No Left Turn in Education, a national group that supports parents as they amp up grassroots organizing around the country. It really brought the playbook of seasoned GOP activists to school boards. And so this is where you remember you'd have parents storming school boards and, all types of drama in that regard. You have Moms for Liberty, Education First Alliance, all types of advocacy groups pick this up and run with it. If you had children during the 80s, I would imagine this feels very much like the satanic panic of the 80s is what we're looking at right now. And so back to Christopher Rutho, meanwhile, who's still then and today very much in play. According to him, his life's work is organized around a simple mission: to challenge and then overthrow the left-wing ideological regime that has dominated American life for a generation. So this man is for real. Back in March of 2021, he tweeted the exact strategy that you see here that actually played out, which was the strategic goal to make critical race theory toxic in the public imagination. He tweeted, the goal is to have the public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think critical race theory. We have decodified the term and will recodify it to annex the entire range of cultural constructions that are unpopular with America. And so today he's still raging against critical race theory. He also rages against what he calls gender ideology and social decay. And people drink this up like Kool-Aid and turn on teachers in the process. Interestingly, around this same time is when the 1619 project that we talked about earlier starts getting explicitly banned. And so school boards start facing lawsuits and records requests regarding what they're teaching. And if they're teaching critical race theory, this costs money, it costs time, both of which are not plentifully available in schools. It is also within this context that state governments and school boards are responding with legislation and policies categorized mistakenly as anti-critical race theory legislation. Not all of these measures ban the same things that you see here. Some don't really even seem to know what exactly they're banning. More often, these bills have very vague wording and do nothing or change nothing other than create a lot of confusion in general and frankly stress for our teachers. To date, 49 states, including North Carolina, have taken steps, whether it's passed or still on the books. 49 states have taken steps at the state level with legislation seeking to curb some kind of aspect of how teachers discuss America's past and the impact on today's world, all but Delaware as of last year anyway. So I don't know what's happening in Delaware, but we should probably find out. Most of the proposed bills around the nation fall into 5 different categories of legislation. So the exclusion of so-called divisive concepts is very common in these bills. So you can't talk about racism, can't talk about sexism, so on. This really impacts ultimately if and how controversial issues are taught in K-12 classrooms, which I would argue we see the negative consequences of not learning how to discuss controversial issues together in our adult society today. We do a pretty poor job of that. And so some legislation mandates the presentation, for instance, of both sides equally or both sides objectively when talking about controversial issues. We'll talk in a minute about why that can be pretty problematic itself. Some bills prohibit students from addressing any topic that might cause discomfort. Can we think about that for a minute? You can't do anything in the classroom that might make a student discomfort. How do you legislate discomfort? How does a teacher measure whether they're causing their students discomfort? As an educator of 20 years, I would argue that discomfort is literally often the feeling you feel before you have a big learning moment or a big paradigm shift, right? Has anybody ever been comfortable when they learn trigonometry? I can't imagine. So I would argue that instead of trying to legislate discomfort, we should be working to get comfortable feeling discomfort. And a lot of the legislation also goes after the discussion of identity concepts. So this means proposals that restrict acknowledging race or gender or other social identities in the classroom. This is really where you see the debate lighting up today, I would say, again, around LGBTQ legislation, transgender issues, the newly recently implemented Parents' Bill of Rights, for instance, dovetails into this. And I think this is really the evolved propaganda campaign that we're now going to be facing. And so much of the legislation, again, is incredibly ambiguous. And so it's concerning that 1 out of 3 measures overall include enforcement provisions in which funding for a school district can be withheld if the school district is seen as being in violation of the past legislation. So think about that. You might be teaching about racism in class, and that is so problematic that we are going to hold your funding for, I don't know, your school's free breakfast program because hungry kids are less important than this, right? Like if you think about that, it's egregious, really. The president of the American Historical Association in 2021 wrote a great an opinion piece And she ultimately said all of this kind of legislation is ultimately corrupting the study of history, that it's reducing students to political pawns. She said that children deserve to learn history from teachers who are professionally trained to teach it, of course, that they're entitled to a curriculum consistent with professional scholarship, of course, and that if that history includes criticism of our nation, its institutions, or its people, such reckoning can take place constructively and respectively, but it is likely to generate discomfort, and teachers should not be required or even expected to confront students with an opposing viewpoint that runs contrary to available evidence. And so just to quickly drill down into North Carolina, specifically, and what we've been up to these past few years, the first thing I think that it's important to note is that for those of you in K-12 education, if you don't spend your days in these weeds like some of us, teachers have a standard course of study to follow. There are guidelines set by North Carolina's Board of Education and the Department of Public Instruction that outline what students are expected to know, the skills they're expected to be able to do, what they're to understand by the end of each grade and course. And so it's under this umbrella that local districts, the professionals, and the teachers implement the actual curriculum to best cover those standards. And so this is just another reminder that it's not the Wild West of history education out there, right? Teachers don't just get to teach any old thing they want. I don't know that there is any area of life out there as regulated as K-12 education. And so the idea that all of this, crazy stuff is happening is just, if you know anything about it, that's just not true. The system doesn't allow for it. And we actually saw the beginning of this public debate that I'm talking about in North Carolina over our standards revision process. In April of 2019, the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction was given the go-ahead by the State Board of Education to begin the same process it engages in every 4 or 5 years or so of reviewing and possibly revising the state academic standards for K-12 social studies for history education. This is a common process. It's usually over a 1-year, fairly rigorous process, which includes practicing teachers and education professionals, experts from all over the state, sometimes professors, and folks work in teams to review each grade level standards, and they provide their expertise on improving them and making sure we're kind of keeping up with the time, so to speak. The work gets done in 2019, it gets presented to the state board, and in determining whether or not to approve the proposed standards, we see this debate mirroring the national rhetoric of the hour open up in North Carolina. And so basically, there were opponents of the revised state standards on the state board, including our state's Lieutenant Governor, Mark Robinson, who is, by the way, currently a candidate for governor. The Lieutenant Governor said the proposed standards painted America in too negative of a light. It did not celebrate enough the country's great achievements. Those on the board in favor of the standards said that they appreciated the way it presented a more accurate view of the country's history. They liked that it elevated stories of traditionally marginalized people and events, such as Indigenous people, Black people, women. More voices were present at the table. A draft 5 of the standards was approved narrowly in February of 2021. It did end up including terminology such as race and identity, but one particular point of revision regarded the phrases systemic racism and gender identity. Gender and systemic were terms that were removed between drafts 4 and 5. And so the board's majority voting in favor of the standards said that they do think it will better address both the nation's accomplishments and the instances when America didn't live up to its values with an eye towards progress. But other members of the board said the standards are overly negative, that they're anti-capitalist. In the words of the Lieutenant Governor, the standards are leftist dogma. I encourage all of you to go and read the standards yourself if you have not, and make your own opinion about that. It's also worth noting that the years-long process includes many points of feedback from any and all stakeholders who want to give an opinion, teachers, parents, people with enough time on their hands to want to check it out and have an opinion. And the board received around 7,000 pieces of feedback. 85% of that was supportive and positive. Due to COVID, the implementation of the new standards was delayed, but they are now in place. I don't see any kids leaving their history classes in tears, so check. The other thing that I should point out is, I don't want to stay in the weeds of the standards revisions process. However, it's worth noting that the very next month, March 2021, the Lieutenant Governor, Mark Robinson, who again was adamantly opposed to the new standards, announced the creation of the FACTS task force. FACTS stands for Fairness and Accountability in the Classroom for Teachers and Students. He describes this as a task force dedicated to giving students, parents, and school faculty a voice to speak out about cases of bias, inappropriate materials, or indoctrination that they see or experience in public schools. So the first order of business was creating an electronic form for individuals to report their teachers or teachers in the community who were indoctrinators. It initially received about 500 submissions from around the state. Due to open records requests, you can read every single one. I have, and I encourage you to do the same. From my impression, very few were complaints of actual classroom activity or credible examples of specific teachers expressing any kind of bias or indoctrination. Most were actually general complaints reiterating the talking points of the anti-history propaganda campaign. There were very few my teacher or even my child's teacher. It was almost much more general than that. These teachers, those teachers. A lot of the entries were funny. It was people pushing back against the task force itself and roasting the lieutenant governor. Very few seem to be specific in actual complaint instances, but please, like I said, go read them. Never take what somebody says for granted. The commission did release a report in August of 2021. They came to a different conclusion than me. The lieutenant governor ascertained that indoctrination is overwhelmingly happening in North Carolina's public schools. You know, I don't really like or do math, but with 500 submissions total and almost 100,000 public school teachers in North Carolina, I would argue that even if every single one of those 500 submissions were like 100% out of the park, glaringly obvious indoctrination, that would still be a very low rate of indoctrination, right? I think my math is right on that. And so that's if all of the submissions were actually valid and validated, which again, I would say the majority are not by any means, but I digress. Also in March of 2021, the General Assembly took up House Bill 324, ensuring dignity and non-discrimination in schools, which was North Carolina's own legislation to prevent teachers from indoctrinating students with liberal ideology infused with critical race theory. It passed right down party lines on September 1st, 2021. Tim Moore, who was the House Speaker, Republican from Cleveland County, celebrated the legislation by saying our schools should be a place where children are educated and inspired. However, some, as in teachers, have hijacked our classrooms to instill their own hateful anti-American values in our students, while any opposing viewpoints to this theory from students or other teachers are met with rebuke or bullying. Who? What teacher is doing this? What teacher is hijacking a classroom and teaching kids to hate America? Show me who. 20 years of doing this work, I have never seen that. And I have even seen some bad teachers. Most teachers are amazing, but I've never seen anybody doing that. And so again, read the bills yourself. Be prepared to be confused. There are statements you will agree with, actually. But when considered within the context of demonizing teachers or legislating a problem that isn't even documented or actually happening, that then becomes problematic posturing. Some of it is also just problematic, plain and simple. So one small example from the North Carolina bill, which had this long list of what public schools should not be promoting. You'll see there that it's, again, anything that leaves students feeling discomfort, back to that word discomfort. And again, I agree. Students should not be taught history in a way that disempowers them, that makes them feel shamed or blamed or guilt, because those aren't engaging or empowering learning emotions. But discomfort, how can you study slavery, even by elevating amazing stories like Elizabeth Keckley's and Abraham Galloway's, and not feel some discomfort? If you don't feel some discomfort, something is probably inherently not working within you, right? Students have to feel. History, social studies, these are courses where students can develop the all-important empathy. But to say I can't do anything in the classroom that makes a student feel discomfort, this, again, is literally the feeling that often accompanies major learning. And then, how is it supposed to work? Who gets to decide whether or not I violated this notion of discomfort? How do I get accused of and punished for making my students uncomfortable? I guess you can never assign homework anymore, because that sure makes kids uncomfortable, right? So the only reason that this is not currently law in North Carolina is because it was later vetoed by North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper. Even still, North Carolina, as in other states, we saw this trickle down to local governments, and this has been acknowledged as an actual strategy. So you might remember this name from the past, but former Trump advisor Steve Bannon said on his podcast, this was in May of 2020, that the path to save the nation is very simple. It's going to go through the school boards. And let me just share one example from a local school board here in North Carolina. This is how this played out in Johnston County, North Carolina. The summer of 2021, the Johnston County School Board of, the Johnston County Board of Commissioners said that they would not approve the school board's funding until it adopted a policy to help eliminate divisive teaching topics. The commissioners basically held the school system's funding hostage until they came up with a policy that they wanted. So let that sit for a minute. Again, at a time when schools back are already severely underfunded and understaffed, overworked, and trying to make up for over a year of COVID learning loss, the county, Johnston County, withheld almost $8 million in education funding for purely political purposes. Pass an anti-CRT bill or you don't get any money for your students. So in the end, the school board did come back with what's called Policy Code 5100. Again, I encourage you to go and read it if you have time and care about this type of thing. But in a nutshell, it said that teachers can be disciplined or fired if they undermine, again, the nation's foundational documents, if they fail to recognize or present all people who contributed to American society as reformists, innovators, heroes to our culture, and a host of other things. You'll also see here that when discussing a controversial topic, which may arise out of the North Carolina Standard Courses study, staff members should remain neutral and present the information without bias. Topics must include multiple and varied viewpoints in an effort to stimulate thought without persuasion or outside pressure among students. Look, no doubt teachers should not tell students who to vote for or advocate for a particular political party. Those personal views do not belong in a classroom, and I have never in my life met a teacher who disagrees with that. And so now, though, with this legislation, again, back to the example of slavery, when I teach slavery, I'm supposed to remain neutral. When I discuss the women's suffrage movement, I'm supposed to remain neutral over the fact that there were men who didn't think I was intelligent enough to vote. The bill goes on to say that all people deserve full credit and recognition for their struggles, accomplishments throughout U.S. history. That piece about we're all reformists, innovators, and heroes to our culture. So when I teach my students about 1898 Wilmington, the coup, I'm supposed to present the aggressors, literally people who overthrew a government, as heroes? How does that work exactly? And it's all a little bit more complicated than that. And I would argue that a lot of this literally spits in the face of the democracy that they're saying that we should be upholding on a daily basis. And so this response from Tamika Walker Kelly, who's the president of the North Carolina Association of Educators, I think really cuts at the heart of so much of what I'm saying. And it was a great response when she said the Johnston County Board of Commissioners and the Johnston County Board of Education are attempting to stoke fears, divide parents and communities, and discredit Johnston County's hardworking teachers. All they are doing is hurting our children. Teachers are trained professionals and practitioners who know how to best design age-appropriate lessons for students, help them grapple with complex facts, and teach them to be critical thinkers and lifelong learners. That is literally what a teacher is. Our students deserve honesty and education rooted in facts and truth. Loving America and what it stands for means learning about our history, good and bad. If we censor our history and ignore today's challenges, we will never live up to the ideals of liberty and justice for all. Thank you, Polly Murray. This manufactured outrage to score political points by creating a problem that does not exist will hurt our children and diminish the quality of their education for the sake of our students and the future of this state. Stop it. Knock it off. And so let's think about the damage that this is doing, because I argue, Ms. Kelly has laid this out in a really excellent way, but the founding fathers, the same ones that so many of these bills proclaim must be celebrated and heralded and never questioned, maintained that the success of this fragile American democracy would depend on the competency of its citizens. So the founding fathers strongly believed that preserving democracy would require an educated population that could understand political and social issues, that would participate in civic life, that would vote wisely, that would protect the rights and freedoms granted under our foundational documents, that we would know how to resist tyranny and demagogues. So waging a propaganda campaign with our classrooms at the heart of it in order to fan the flames of fear and rally a political base, I would say flies directly in the face of cultivating an educated citizenry, and so directly in the face of the very principles that these folks say that they want to uphold. Again, regardless of where each of us falls on the political spectrum, I want to make sure it's clear how this specter of political drama negatively impacts teachers and students and communities, because it does. On a most basic level, the division and the confusion has been and is still being sowed. It creates additional stress for already overworked education professionals. Let's not forget that our teachers are experiencing the hardest years of their careers. They have shouldered so much since 2019. And today I am seeing teachers more exhausted and burned out and frankly depressed than ever. And I mean that. If you want to do a search on teachers and mental health, it's excruciating. It's a hard job. It's incredibly rewarding, but it's an equally draining job. Add to that all the challenges teachers face and the negative and unnecessary rhetoric that sounds like something right out of Fahrenheit 451. And it's just another chip in the armor that teachers already feel they have to wear to survive another day in the classroom. Schools should be spaces where young people learn to participate in civil discourse. And that includes the discussion of current events and potentially controversial issues. These are ideas that, again, date back to our founding fathers. But this rhetoric has caused many teachers, especially new teachers, your first year, you're a deer in headlights anyway. And so it's causing teachers to just determine it's safer to not even bother. Because if it's not clear where the line is based on poorly written legislation, how do you know when and how not to cross it? And have you looked around at society today? Again, I think we could all use a little bit more instruction on how to have civil discourse. So if it's safest, easiest even for a teacher today to just brush past the hard history, to brush past discourse, because for them, why take the risk, right? Then they're probably going to do it. And then our classrooms aren't teaching a full and comprehensive history. And when our classrooms revert back to assembly line education of dates and names, or the Disney version of our past, we end up with a generation of kids who aren't interested in history, or they think it's boring, or worst case, they hate it because they don't see themselves in it anywhere. And then they won't have the knowledge or tools that they are going to need to fix all of our mistakes when they take over. So again, weaponizing our classrooms for ideological gain, it harms our teachers, it harms our students, it harms our democracy. And so as I get ready to end here, I do want to say one thing about government service, because I don't want to seem like I am just bashing anybody who is an elected official. Legislators at all levels are really serving in impossible roles these days. It's especially school board members. I'm going to tell you right now, I would not run for or serve on a school board if you paid me $1 million a year. The thick skin that you have to have, I don't have it. So I also think it's really important to have empathy for the people in leadership roles, because they're faced with angry people on all sides every single day. You can't win. I know that that is hard, but so is teaching. And we need elected officials who are going to choose our teachers over ideological politics, regardless of party. And so let me just close up here by leaving you with some questions, not answers, but some questions to ponder when thinking back through everything that I've shared on speed speaking. So again, I want you to think about what triggered this debate about history education. What is this? What was this and what is this really about, do you think? What is the actual goal of this fight over what children learn in history, which has been mislabeled critical race theory for a long time? And most importantly, what is this distracting us from? What else should we be focusing on instead? And what in God's name do we do about it all? I said I wasn't going to give you any answers, but I do want to offer you some thoughts on what our legislators should be focused on instead of this made-up problem of classroom indoctrination. This is just a few random things to think about. What about the fact that North Carolina ranks near the bottom of all states in K-12 funding, nearly $5,000 less than the national average on per pupil spending? Beginning teacher pay. How are we going to recruit teachers when North Carolina ranks 46th nationally and 11th out of the 12 states in the Southeast alone? You tell me, how can we hire and retain talented teachers on these numbers? And what does this say about what value our state places on the role of a teacher? Speaking of valuing teachers and specifically valuing them as professionals, North Carolina removed salary increases for educators with advanced degrees in 2013. If so many folks are so worried about teaching practices and incompetent indoctrinating teachers and brainwashing, why wouldn't you encourage them to get more training? And relatedly, educator professional development was zeroed out of the state budget during the recession. It was never reinstated, but folks are continually going to rage about the malpractice of teachers. It's so problematic that the state invests nothing in any kind of professional development for teachers. Again, that just doesn't add up for me. Big surprise, there is now a shortage of teachers, of bus drivers, of substitutes, of support staff. And this is being exacerbated by a steady stream of mid-year departures because people just get fed up and they can't do it anymore. Can you imagine why, based on what I've shared tonight? All of this makes it harder on the teachers left in the classrooms. And the teachers that we do have are exhausted. They are picking up the burden of unfilled positions, doing duties on their lunch. These, again, are some of the hardest times of their career. They're stressed out, they're burned out, and they're being expected to do more with less than ever before. What about our state's Leandro case? How about that? Our state has been involved in litigation for almost 30 years. In 1994, 5 school districts, along with families in low-wealth counties, filed a lawsuit against the state of North Carolina, arguing that the state was not meeting its constitutional obligation for sound basic education. Their counties didn't have enough money to provide an equal education for their children. Despite the fact that they tax their residents higher than average. This is still true today. This North Carolina Supreme Court ruled twice in 97 and 2004 that North Carolina has a constitutional obligation to ensure all children have access to a sound basic education from well-trained and teachers and principals, and they deserve sufficient classroom resources, but still our state was falling short. And those 5 counties that filed suit, which were Polk, Halifax, Robertson, Vance, and Cumberland. This issue extends beyond them. In fact, the Public School Forum just released its report, still today, one of the biggest education policy issues in North Carolina in 2024 is the disparities between high wealth counties and low wealth counties. Do we even get into the issues such as, like health issues, public health issues, from the fact that 1 in 6 children live in poverty in North Carolina. These are kids that are in our schools and they are hungry. Why is there not a frenzy about that instead of this? The 2021 suicide rate for children ages 10 to 17 was the highest in 2 decades. And according to the Center for Homeland Defense and Security, we see a continual increase in the number of school shootings, particularly between 2017. And I didn't look at the numbers for this year, but I feel like that was also true even higher in 2023. So again, where's the attention to any one of these issues? And these are not even all of them. So I would say we don't need bills to ensure balance in the classroom. We need to support our teachers as they work tirelessly on making the dreams and ambitions of America a reality for our future leaders. And, as I finish up, I do want to be transparent and acknowledge that I have spent my time talking about one broad propaganda campaign against history education, or rather a campaign to use history education to rile folks up to rally a political base, right? I think we need to see beyond and through that. There's propaganda across political parties, across issues. And so leading into that question of what do we do philosophically speaking, I think we also have to address the underlying toxic infection of polarization and identity politics. We are corroding ourselves and we are corroding our schools because of it. I recently ran across this phrase, mutual radicalization. It's also a book that is now on my list, which is a natural human tendency to look at everyone on the other side of the political spectrum as if they were the same as the leaders and spokespeople of that side. I think we all find ourselves doing this. If we keep seeing everyone who identifies politically as another party than our own, or as a crazy person or the enemy, the divisions in our society are just going to keep growing and keep getting worse. And I would say ruin us all. We're almost there, really. And so we have to remember that most people are not on the extremes of these issues. Most of what we hear is from the people who are on the extremes of these issues. And a lot of that is the fault of social media platforms, where people lose their mind and preach into echo chambers and act like trolls and believe any and everything they see. And now, of course, it's been proven that there are bots that aren't even real people that are literally exacerbating the divide. So what can we do? Some of my recommendations may surprise you really quickly here, because I'm actually not going to ask you to storm your school boards in support of history education, although we'll ask Miss Moore Sloan what she thinks. Maybe she thinks we should, but I'll be interested to hear what she has to say. But first, I say don't engage on its social media or get your information from social media posts about education policy or any issue. Get out of the Facebook groups, even if folks are posting what you like, maybe especially if folks are posting what you like. I have never seen any true back and forth conversation happen on social media. The algorithms are pouring gasoline all over the flames of division, and we cannot live like this. I say get off unless you're looking at funny animal videos. Let it go. Obviously, do your own research before forming an opinion. If people had done their research just on this issue that we've been talking about, I don't think we would be here today. Similar to not trusting your friend or your uncle, consult multiple vetted sources. There's not a massive campaign among our teachers to destroy America, to make kids hate America. There just isn't. There never has been. Propaganda also is not just a far right-wing tool. So we've got to always ask the question to really think about what we're ingesting and do the research before we make an opinion. I always say get and stay curious, not only about others, but also about yourself. Again, if we are going to bridge the political divide, we've got to acknowledge our own fear and misperceptions about others, understanding how our thoughts and feelings can really be inflamed or triggered by political leaders, by propaganda. What if, rather than defriending, rather than cutting family members out of our lives, we stay present and we keep having curious conversations, even when they make our stomachs hurt. And we keep saying, I vehemently disagree with you, but I still love you because I can hold both of those things. Let's keep talking. That's doing the work, right? Now, not that cutting somebody out of your life isn't hard, but keeping them in it sometimes is harder. My father-in-law sat at Thanksgiving and started telling me about all the indoctrination happening in K-12 classrooms. He's a pediatrician, hasn't had anything to do with a K-12 classroom since he sat in one. He's a doctor, which I've never pretended to know how to give a shot or treat hand, foot, mouth or anything like that. But even still, when he started going down the list of all the Fox News talking points, again, education professional of 20 years, instead of flipping the table, I downed a glass of wine and I had a conversation with him. I stayed there in it. I think when we have the capacity to be creative, to be courageous, to be patient, we need to be curious. We need to ask questions and try and have those conversations without stabbing somebody with the fork at the Thanksgiving table, and do it in person. And I just want to elevate that phrase, when we have the capacity. Let me also state the fairly obvious. I'm saying that from the perspective of a white woman. I'm not encouraging, for instance, a person of color to sit across from a racist and say, why do you hate me? If somebody is denying your humanity, if it's an unsafe situation, that's a wholly different ballgame than what I'm talking about. So I do just want to acknowledge that. But as much as it feels good to know we are right, we aren't going to get out of this loop of silos and echo chambers and a breakdown of democratic thought and communication unless we stop digging in our heels. This is a great report from the Connecticut Humanities Institute, who said research indicates that the divisiveness will continue to grow if the fear and the other and the wounds fueling that fear are not addressed. Curiosity and respect for somebody else's views are the foundation for bridging the political divide. And I think that's really important as we head into 2024, when we're going to see more of these types of propaganda campaigns like what we've seen against history. So am I saying you should have a conversation with somebody from Moms for Liberty rather than run over their road sign, their roadside recruiting sign? As someone who's admittedly done both, yeah, that's what I'm saying. Even as good as it felt to take out that sign, show up and have a conversation, human to human. This comes down to a matter of Democrats and Republicans, people from all political spectrums, really looking at one another and recognizing that we do have goals that need to be achieved together, because humanity depends on us. Our students, our kids depend on us, and neither side can achieve without the active cooperation of the other side. I do recommend this series by Danielle Allen in the Washington Post that gets at a lot of what I'm talking about. She is a professor at Harvard, the director of the Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation. And she basically argues that democracy will not survive, that it is fragile and it won't survive. It will never deliver on its promise of freedom and equality unless we come out of our silos and listen and work across ideological divides. And she acknowledges it won't be easy, but that it is essential. And I think honestly, on a truly local community grassroots level, the best thing you can do is try to find ways to support the schools in your area, whether you have a child or a grandchild or not in school. Find ways to make teachers feel the love, just on a really basic level. Get in touch with the PTA, not the principal. They're too harried and busy. Get in touch with the PTA, drop some coffee, drop some bagels, send some donuts. Think big with your friends, adopt a local school, but help change the narrative and focus on local schools and talk about how much you appreciate those teachers and the school staffs for what they are doing. That is, I think love is in the details. Love is in those small acts sometimes. And so I'll return to the words of Polly Murray, who I mentioned before, and who said, "It's taken me a lifetime to discover that true emancipation lies in the acceptance of the whole past and deriving strength from all my roots and facing up to the degradation as well as the dignity of my ancestors." And I think these words are relevant to each of us, regardless of who your ancestors are, because they are lessons to be learned in the degradation and the dignity. Not shame or blame or division, but strength and a way forward. And I'll just end by saying we owe our teachers a debt of gratitude. We owe them our trust and our support as they engage in this critical work with our young people. What makes the miracle of public education work in this country is communities coming together in spite of our differences to put our children, all children, first. And that includes lifting our teachers up as they provide safe learning environments and emotional support and all of that love that they show for our students. You know, Vanda Gorman wrote that being American is more than a pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we repair it. I always end my trainings with teachers to say that every day they step into the classroom, they have the chance and the power to repair. And we need to give them every bit of our support in doing just that. So I'm going to stop there.
Okay, Christie, thank you so much. You know, the only problem with this presentation this evening is the fact that we didn't have the governor, and especially the lieutenant governor, all of the legislators, 170 of them, all of the principals in the state of North Carolina, and all the superintendents and as many teachers to hear this presentation.
You're trying to get me shut down, huh? Be fired.
I mean, it is something that they need to hear, without a doubt. And if folks on this Zoom didn't know exactly why we are where we are today, you should know it now because of the perspective, the historical perspective that you've given us, and all of this great information. It's incredible to know where we are today in terms of our collective with regard to what people are trying to do to kill the message and messengers. And I know that you'll take any questions or any comments. Folks, feel free to do so. Brother Johnson, see your hand up.
Good afternoon, everybody. And Ms. Norris, that was an outstanding presentation. Thank you so much. I wish they could clone you and put you in the highest levels of government. Maybe you should run for office somewhere and dictate what goes on. Unfortunately, I understand completely what's happening because I'm a product of integration, and I always tell people that progress comes with a price. And I can assure you that had it not been for integration, if kids of color, of all colors, were still in their schools that they were born in, I'm sure they would be learning Black history and still get educated and learn math and science and biology, because I once looked up all of the great inventors from the 1700s to now. The list ran out. I couldn't count them all that were people of color. I'm almost certain that that would be also considered critical race theory if they were teaching that in school. From the fact that the monitors that they use, the telephones that they use, the dry cleaners, the supermarket, the frozen trucks that put the food in the supermarket. So it goes back to what Dr. Parker just alluded to when he started his comment, was that we have to become more conscious of who we select and elect in these offices, because if they're not soldiers, if they don't know what they have to fight for, if they become part of the pecking order because they belong to a certain group of, say, for instance, chairman of this, chairman of that, whatever political party, then we're going to stay where we are. And some people in history, through this class, I learned that there were people way before us in the 17 and 1800s who realized that this was going to be a continuing problem, but not only decades, but centuries. They assumed that the only way to get out of this was to pick up arms and fight for the right to be considered equal. I think integration pacified a lot of people that felt like they were being accepted when they started seeing athletes making millions of dollars. But that was to pacify people, because the bottom line is we're still in a place where now our kids can't learn the basics of who invented this and who invented that, because it's critical race theory. And history should be what you called it, true history or hard history. That would still draw the attention of people who, for whatever reason, I don't know whether they're afraid of the psychological aspects of their children learning, in some cases, what kind of monsters they were. But I have hope. Maybe not in my lifetime, but we'll see it. But unless we start picking leaders who will stand for what your principles are and what everybody's in this Zoom meeting principles are, this is going to be a long road, because as we look around, our herds are thinning. And the kids who are coming through now are not being taught the true history. Us who are a little older, we know the history, but we don't teach it. So it's a particular hard place to be in right now. But I want to thank you for your presentation. It gives me a little bit of hope that someone like you is in a place where kids are learning. And I hope that the word gets spread. I wish there could be a YouTube. You should put it on YouTube. It should be mandatory watching for everybody. Again, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson,
Thanks.
for those comments. And you asked a question that I always ask, which is, what are we so afraid of?
What are we afraid of?
are we afraid of? Because as I said, I would argue, yes, our history is hard, but there's so much beauty there too. There's so much, again, through every period of history, for people who have been oppressed, from indigenous people to, Black people, there are always stories of resistance and resilience and perseverance, and young people can be so activated by that. And so I think if you understand what we're actually talking about, I just don't understand who can't get behind. Now, I do agree that, I think sometimes teachers, there has to be training. If you are, for instance, only teaching slavery as slaves who were beat, and, you're only teaching the hard, then that can be that's not the complete story either, right? Just like you mentioned, the whole story. We also had, the Robert Williams and folks who were armed self-resistance. So it's really about being comprehensive in whatever we're teaching. I remember, and maybe Miss Sloan wants to speak to this, but when I was teaching 8th grade, your students know when you're giving them a bunch of mess. They know when you're just teaching some vanilla, flavorless history, and they tune out. And I'm afraid that that is happening more and more, and we are seeing the repercussions of that in society. So I think all of this has some very, if it's not measurable, it's at least some very subjective negative impacts. So thank you for your thank you, though.
You're quite welcome.
Yeah, I just want to echo the sentiment of Mr. Johnson. That was a great presentation and much needed. And to your point, primary reason I rose my hand, I worked with a bunch of high schoolers in Reedsville 2 weeks ago. And you're right. They know. And they're more interested in the truth and the facts, and will respond to that more with more energy than they do to us trying to couch anything. To what you just mentioned about Robert F. Williams, one of the students I was having a presentation with was talking about the difference between being nonviolent and being someone who prioritized making sure that they defended themselves. And it was a really good conversation. So he was MLK all about nonviolence? Yes, there was an ideology. And those who said they would respond with violence were clearly indicating that they were about self-preservation. They were not looking to be violent. So these conversations just are so enlightening if we allow them to be. And I'm glad to have been able to check into this. And Dr. Parker spoke very highly of you in any way, and so your reputation definitely preceded you, and you met every expectation of it. So I just want to say thank you again.
Thank you. But Dr. Parker, I like low expectations, so then I can exceed them.
Well, you exceeded the high expectation.
Okay.
Other questions or comments?
I was just gonna say, well, of course, Ms. Norris, thank you so much for your presentation. It's always great to hear you speak. I always come away learning so much. I wanted to mention how we're at a critical moment in North Carolina, especially with the upcoming elections with North Carolina Superintendent of Public Instruction. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yes, I think I strongly encourage you all to read about the candidates for Superintendent of Public Instruction. You have two candidates, one, Mo Green, who has experience in the system, a lot of experience in the system. The other, Michelle Morrow, who I think you need to just read about her. I think that's, she has never taught, and would be somebody who is in the camp of the propaganda spinners that we have talked about this evening, I think. And so what I would encourage you to do is to read about the candidates and think, who is going to do best for the education I want to see for my child? You know, is experience as a teacher, well, I'm sorry, she homeschools her kids, so she has homeschool taught. I think that is a critically important race. And if you start to think about a lot of these state elections, the governor's race is very important. You know, we talked a little bit about one of the candidates today. And again, I'm not telling you what to do or who to vote for, but you definitely need to pay attention to that and ask your friends to pay attention to that, not off of Facebook or sound bites, but to really look at these folks and the types of things that they are saying. I'm curious to hear your opinion, just based, I'm guessing you've asked because you have one. What is your?
Oh, absolutely. I'm very scared for this state. I've been an educator for, let me say 15 years, and it is a very scary situation, just to see where education is going. You did an awesome job highlighting some of the issues that teachers are facing, and someone who prides myself on teaching true history the way it actually happened. Of course, we're going to, like I said, always make it age appropriate, but it's very scary. You know, it's just the election with the lieutenant governor, some of the comments that he's made, and some of what I know for a fact has transpired regarding our social studies standards. You can just kind of see where things will be stripped away. I also am very scared with the fact with the North Carolina superintendent position. In my opinion, if you've never taught in a public school system, you have no business running for that position. And it is scary and alarming, some of the things that I'll say allegedly said, but many people have talked about, like, she's called for a public execution of President Obama, President Biden, things like that. There was a few inflammatory comments made by her. And I will also say Mark Johnson regarding anti-Semitic, sexist comments, a whole bunch of things there. So it's very scary that this could possibly be the people shaping North Carolina politics and institutions. I'll put it like that. Yeah. That's as nice as I can dress it up.
That was good. That was good. And you think about, how can you get your high school students to speak respectfully to one another when the leaders are speaking with such hate and vitriol and disdain, so beyond even all the specifics of the politics and all of that, it's also about the example that we set and what it means to be a human being. So I really feel for teachers in that regard too. When you have people in the most, you know, powerful positions who misbehave so childishly, and then you expect respect from your students, that can be hard to square, I can imagine. So I think that, thank you for what you do.
Sister Mason Hogans, glad you're with us this evening.
Hey, I'm so glad we had one on Tuesday.
Yeah.
Education equity meetings on Wednesday. So I'm so grateful that we were able to be here. And hey, Christie, thank you so much for coming today. We really enjoyed your presentation. I just have a visceral response to this notion of making kids feel uncomfortable when Black and Native kids have to sit and talk about enslavement. And I mean, I think even on those grounds, we should be challenging stuff, even in a policy-based conversation, because if that's all it takes, But I wonder, in terms of Carolina K-12, I know that there are a lot of DEI initiatives that are threatened with decrease of funding and things of that nature. I wonder what's the status and the state of your organization. You'll do a lot of work. We were talking about you in the Color of Education Guiding Committee, and just wanted to know what is the status and the state of your work, and is there anything that we can do to support? Do you need any support from us, and what we might be able to do?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Hey, Dr. Parker.
Yes.
Would you mind stopping the recording?
Okay, I certainly will.